the memory cards that meet their need at a price that works for them. When it comes to the size of the card and its format, you'll note, as we indicate here in the slide, that the size is at your discretion, but the format must be FAT. The FAT, or FAT file system, it stands for File Allocation Table. This is one of the early disk format types. It sort of predates Microsoft's proprietary NTFS or Apple's proprietary HFS. Microsoft's NTFS and Apple's HFS are both proprietary systems to those companies and to those systems and operating systems, so they don't work well in a third-party device like this. Instead, we're going with the more generic FAT format. It could be any of the FATs. You'll sometimes see FAT16 or FAT32. Those are fine as long as it's FAT. XFAT is not yet supported, but it's something we're looking at, and we may offer that in the future. So at present, the file format must be FAT, and that generates the occasional service call. It's every once in a while somebody will buy a memory card, put it in their computer, and format it, not paying attention to the fact that the card was just formatted with either Microsoft's or Apple's proprietary formats rather than the FAT format, and then trying to use that card in the player. The player acts as if no card is present. It simply won't react and can't read to the card and can't use the card, and the player exhibits the symptoms of a player without a card present. Yet you know full well you've put a card in it, and so we get a number of service calls, and upon further review, we find that the card is not formatted FAT. Simply format your memory cards or memory devices, whether you're using an SD card or you're choosing to use the USB connection on a player to connect a USB memory stick or perhaps a USB hard drive. The key here is to format that memory device FAT. The FAT file format has a couple of limitations. Individual files cannot exceed 4 gigabytes, or gigabytes cannot exceed 4 gigabytes, and the total storage volume size cannot exceed 500 gigs. So half a terabyte is the maximum volume size, and 4 gigs is the maximum file size when using the FAT format. Rarely you'll encounter a piece of media, or perhaps a large video file, that is in fact larger than 4 gigs. And you're not going to be able to use that on a BrightSign player. You'll need to take that file to an external video editing system and cut it into 2 pieces. So the front piece and the back piece, or piece A and piece B. Now the good news is the player can play through those 2 segments seamlessly. So the playback experience is seamless and gives the appearance of being a single file. But the reality is, on your playlist and in your file management, it is 2 files, and it's simply a restriction of FAT that an individual media file cannot exceed 4 gigs. So keep that in mind. But otherwise, choose a size that makes sense to you. Recently in consumer electronics stores, I see 4 and 6 gig SD cards running at a very, very reasonable price, sometimes below $5 for a memory card, and I see up to 64 gigabyte cards available now. They're a little bit expensive. 32 is probably the biggest inexpensive card these days, and on a 32 gig card there's room for literally hours and hours of high definition video. So unless your project includes more than 5 or 6 hours of video, something in the 16 to 32 gigabyte size is going to be more than enough. You generally need to choose a card that's going to be large enough for the presentations you need to run, of course, and any future presentations you've scheduled, because the player will have those ready to go on the card as well. So if I have today's presentation running and I've also scheduled a presentation for tomorrow that's different, both those presentations will be pushed out to the player, and the player will have them both on the card. And though it's running today's presentation, it's also got tomorrow's resident. So make sure when you plan your card size, you take into account how many future presentations and their size you're likely to publish it at a given moment. Otherwise, you'll run into capacity problems on your card. In the background, we take care of a process that we call garbage collection, and the player will in this garbage collection mode, the player maintains awareness of files that are no longer needed and will delete them as space is required. So you don't need to worry about deleting old or bad presentations. We take care of that in the background, but you do need to focus on, how much capacity I need for today's and future presentations. Memory cards come in different speeds or qualities. This has reference to how fast the card is able to write data when you're saving to it, and how fast the card is able to read data out when you're pulling data off the card. This is known as the speed class, and you'll see the speed class on the card. It's normally a number in a circle. It's also often printed in the literature that associates the card. You'll see a card that's class 4 or class 6 or class 10. We recommend class 6 or faster, particularly in applications that require video. You need to be able to get the video file off the card fast enough to decode it and show it. So class 6 or faster. I noticed the other day when I was in my local consumer electronics store that it was hard to find anything slower than class 10. It seems that class 10 has become the new standard. No surprise, really, with the range of digital cameras, both video and still cameras that are out there in the market that want to be able to write images very, very fast as you're taking pictures. So card speeds are on the increase, and that's good for all of us. So class 6 or faster when you choose your card. We're frequently asked, here moving to the next point, what type of video file formats a player can handle. We have on our website a frequently asked question document that addresses this in a lot of detail. So I'm going to just touch on the highlights here. The key being that we support all the usual suspects. When it comes to still images, we support JPEGs, GIFs, bitmaps, and PNGs. It doesn't matter whether those were created on a Macintosh system or on a PC system. Those are very industry standard formats, and our player can use them just fine. The player does not take proprietary formats. A good example would be Adobe's Photoshop proprietary formats. Those are not supported by the player. But if you're using Photoshop, it's a very simple matter to take your finished image and export it as a JPEG or a PNG, a file format that our player easily handles. Keep in mind that JPEG images are highly compressed and require some CPU to decode. So bear that in mind when you're building your presentations. When it comes to video file formats, the same is true. We support the generic industry standard video formats, MPEG-1, MPEG-2, and MPEG-4 Part 10, also known as H.264. H.264 is becoming a very, very common video file format. It's used in almost all the video cameras that are consumer cameras out there today. And H.264 is a video file format that's easy to create from inside virtually every video editing piece of software I've ever experienced. Certainly Final Cut Pro on the Macintosh, Adobe Premiere, Edius from Grass Valley, the Avid systems that are used in high-end broadcast and studio production. All of these editing systems are capable of creating MPEG-1, MPEG-2, or MPEG-4 Part 10, also called H.264. There are proprietary video formats out there that the player cannot handle, just as there are proprietary image formats. For example, if you're editing on an Avid, you'll encounter their file format known as DNX HD. It's a very high-quality video format for editing on an Avid system, but a DNX HD file will not play on a BrightSign player. The same is true on the Apple side. Apple has a proprietary codec that they use in Final Cut Pro called ProRes. Apple ProRes files, a very common file format when you're building and editing and working in the Final Cut Pro world, but it's a proprietary to Apple format, and it will not play on a BrightSign player. So whether you're building presentations or video on an Avid or on a Final Cut Pro or on a PC, you need to do your final save as or render out into a file format that is more generic and more industry standard, MPEG-1, MPEG-2, or MPEG-4 Part 10, also called H.264. Now, those codecs, or those video file formats, are apart from the container type. A point of confusion when it comes to video files is often what type of container or what file extension will the player accept. Is it a .mov that an Apple product might create, or is it .mpg that a Windows machine might correct? The .mpg or .mov or .wmv, if in the case of Windows, those dot extensions have reference to the container. Think of it as a jar, and the shape of the jar and the size and capabilities of the jar are one thing, but what you put into the jar is something else entirely. So, I remember as a kid we picked apricots in the backyard and we would can apricots, but then later we would can peaches. We would use the same jars, and we'd have jars of apricots and we'd have jars of peaches, always with the same jar. Well, the same thing can happen in computer media file types. I can have a .mov out of my Macintosh created with Final Cut Pro, but inside that .mov I might have MPEG-1, MPEG-2, or H.264. So it's an MOV, but what's in the MOV is just as important as how it's wrapped or how it's presented to the machine. We support the generic and more industry standard container types, but we don't support proprietary container types. So we take the .ts or .mov or .mpg or .m2t. These are detailed in the frequently asked questions document. But regardless the container type, the actual contents of the container has to be MPEG-1, MPEG-2, or MPEG-4 Part 10, H.264. Moving on, how will I update contents? This is an important question to ask because fundamentally this has direct bearing on how you will set up your player. Really, there's two ways to update a player's contents, either to physically deliver a new memory card to the player. We call that standalone, or local file publishing. Or you're going to update your player over an Ethernet connection that may or may not include a connection to the big wide world of the Internet. So that would be a network publishing method. If you're publishing via the network, there are things about that network you're going to need to know. And that's what we refer to in the next bullet item here on this slide. We need to know if you're recording, if your network settings will be handled DHCP, or if your network settings will be handled manually or static. DHCP refers to a dynamic host control protocol. This is an automated method for assigning an IP address to a new device on a network. So on a network that supports DHCP, I don't need to worry about IP addresses or anything behind that. I simply connect my device, and it negotiates with the network what IP address and subnet mask and so forth that device will operate on. But there are plenty of network environments where that negotiation is not possible because it's not supported. We refer to those as static environments. And in the case of a static network, the player will need to be programmed in advance with the IP address, the subnet space, the gateway IP address, and DNS server address information. DNS stands for domain name servers. So you will need to know that information in advance, and the IT department who have created that network and who are managing that network will know the answers to these questions, and you'll need to coordinate with them to find out how your player or players should be set up. From a performance and an operational point of view, it does not matter even a little bit which of these addressing schemes are used, whether it's DHCP or static. As long as it's properly configured, you're going to be able to communicate with your player and manage its use. So these are questions you'll need to ask in advance, and you'll need to understand in advance before you even begin to move forward with your BrightSign player. It's time now to talk about downloading and installing BrightAuthor and configuring BrightAuthor. I've launched our website.